Okay, so good afternoon. Today I have a couple of announcements around timings of particular events. First, I'm announcing the Christchurch East by-election will be held on Saturday the 30th of November. As you all know, the by-election is required following the resignation of Labour MP Leanne Dalziel. Second, Cabinet has also signed off on the intended timing and format for the citizens-initiated referendum on the mixed ownership model. The referendum was initiated after a petition regarding the mixed ownership model was signed by 10% of eligible voters and certified by the Clerk of the House of Representatives. The referendum will ask whether New Zealanders support the government sale of up to 49% of Meridian, Mighty River Power, Genesis Power, Solid Energy and TM New Zealand. Cabinet has decided the referendum will be held by postal vote. The voting will open on Friday the 22nd of November and will close 3 weeks later on Friday the 13th of December. We decided to hold the referendum by postal vote as this was the most cost-effective form of casting a vote. The advice is the cost of the postal vote will be around about $9 million instead of $31 million for voting in person. The format and timing of the referendum will be implemented by Order in Council, which will be signed off later today. On a different matter, as you're aware, the government's second share offer is out of the blocks with the Meridian share sale offer opening today. Brokers were invited to submit bids for the Meridian shares based on interest of their clients. As Bill English and Tony Ryle said yesterday, 45% of the total offer has been committed via that broker firm process. It's a good indication that the structure of this offer, paying in 2 instalments over 18 months, with investors getting any dividends in full during that period, is attractive. We've committed to achieving the 85 to 90% New Zealand ownership that we promised, and all New Zealanders will benefit from the government having to borrow less money. People wanting to buy Meridian shares have until 5 PM on Friday the 18th of October to get their applications in. This Wednesday I'll be flying to Canberra for a quick trip to meet newly elected Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott. Australia is of course our most important relationship. We have forged close bonds with Australia in everything from the battlefield to the sporting field, and I expect to enjoy a strong working relationship with the new Prime Minister. Australia is also our largest trading partner for goods and services and a major source of foreign investment, as well as the top destination for New Zealand investment abroad. This means by seeing Mr Abbott on Wednesday, I'll be the first foreign leader to meet Mr Abbott since he was elected. We'll be flying on the Air Force and return to New Zealand the same night, arriving back early on Thursday morning. Next week I'm travelling to Bali for APEC and then on to Brunei for the East Asian Summit. These summits will cover a wide range of political, security and economic topics. Our largest trading partners will be present at these summits, so New Zealand's attendance is important. Around about 44% of global trade now takes place among APEC economies, and 70% of New Zealand's total goods by value is traded with APEC economies. As well as attending these summits, I'll hold bilateral meetings with other political leaders, join talks on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, address the APEC CEO Summit and speak at a tourism development conference hosted by Indonesia. I'll depart New Zealand by the Royal New Zealand Air Force very early on Sunday morning and return late on Friday the 11th of October. In the last few minutes you'll see the announcement from Chris Tremaine that he doesn't intend to seek re-election next year. Mr Tremaine informed me of his decision after Cabinet a fortnight ago and his Cabinet colleagues today. I'd like to thank him for his contribution he's made as National MP since he was elected in 2005 and a Cabinet Minister more recently. Just in terms of my activities this week, it's recess week, so I will be in Wellington, and on Wednesday I'll be in Christchurch. We're flying out to see Tony Abbott on Wednesday afternoon and night. Thursday I'll be in Tokomara, and Auckland I'll be in Auckland on Friday, then depart for Bali on Sunday. Questions?
The mortgage restrictions that are coming in tomorrow, have you given any consideration to asking for exemptions on home building, if that scheme might affect your build program that you've got or want to see in Auckland?
Well, I can't for the life of me see why it would affect home building. I made the comment this morning that I think if the master builders think that will have an impact, they should definitely go and talk to the Reserve Bank, because what the Reserve Bank is trying to do here through its loan-to-value restrictions is not to see less homes built. If anything, actually everybody's aligned in the view that we want more homes built. They're just trying to take a little bit of pressure off the demand side of things. Now, in principle, one of the fastest ways to ensure that house prices don't go galloping away on us is to increase supply, and that's why the government has signed up to these special housing areas, 39,000 extra properties to be consented and walking loan over the next 3 years. So I just don't see the logic on why it will reduce the amount of houses built.
Is there any scope for a regional, well, obviously minimum of understanding, but why wasn't, for example, a regional exemption looked at?
In terms of the
LVR, so...
Oh, LVRs. Look, there were lots of discussions held with the Reserve Bank, but the decisions on the structure of it were determined by the Reserve Bank. We certainly indicated our preference to make sure that first-home buyers could be as looked after as best as possible, and in the end, the conclusion we drew with the fastest way to make that happen was through the Welcome Home Loan Scheme and the extension of KiwiSaver, recognising that the banks have the capacity to write loans in excess of 80%, just not as many as they were before.
But what do people in provinces or regions who don't have house affordability issues be under the same constraints as people in Whitfield or Christchurch, for example?
Well, I think you'd have to direct that to the Reserve Bank. I'm guessing they probably thought it's a little bit complex to sort of administer, because it would put a lot of pressure on the banks in terms of breaking down their lending by region. I think the other point is, in a lot of other parts of the country, houses are effectively cheaper, so it might be easier to build up a 20% deposit, say, in a provincial part of New Zealand from a sheer nominal perspective, rather than Auckland, because the median house price around the country is $390,000, and the median house price in Auckland is $565,000.
It's my understanding that when it comes to financial stability, the government, there isn't that line of independence between the government and the Reserve Bank. You could actually get involved and tell them a bit more what to do. Would you, if you felt those LVRs were being too restrictive and being too draconian and damaging the housing market?
We'd have to take advice on that. I mean, it's not the way I interpret it. My understanding is that the Reserve Bank's always had the right to apply other macro-prudential tools. They in the end have made the decision that they were going to apply these, and they've made the decision on how they were going to apply them. And at the end of the day, I mean, I think it's worth everybody remembering this fact. I mean, one of the things that the Reserve Bank said when it came out with the announcement that we put in place these restrictions was that its expectation was that interest rates would rise less rapidly than they otherwise would have. Now, I see, for instance, David Cunliffe parading around with a person on the front page of the Herald on the Herald website this afternoon. Okay, but that person is looking at a $500,000 house, and they're wanting to borrow $450,000, not the $400,000 that the Reserve Bank would want them to borrow. Well, under National, they're paying $20,000 a year less for interest on their mortgage than they otherwise would have done under Labour. So, we've all got a vested stake here on whether how fast interest rates go up. You've seen today probably the announcement that we're on, I think, a 14-year high for business confidence. The economy is certainly growing. Unemployment is on track down. So the pressure on interest rates is up. And the view of the Reserve Bank is by taking these steps, it's likely that they can increase interest rates on a slower track. That's to the benefit of all New Zealanders.
Was there any discussion about exempting first-home buyers, and where did they get? Was there any discussion about exempting first-home buyers, and where did they get to?
Between the government and the Reserve Bank? Yeah, sure, there was at the time when they were going through it, and we made our feelings pretty strongly to them. Their view was that I think they were 30 or 40% of the overall demand, and that was too big a group to exempt. But I mean, I think there's a few things that are worth remembering. One, banks can still write loans in excess of 80%. They can write less of them than they could have, but they can still write them. Secondly, banks will probably want to prioritise first-home buyers, because it's very much like getting children signed up to a banking account. The banks are very keen to do that as well, because people stay with their bank for a very long period of time if they do that. So there will be a bit of rationing, but it's more likely to ration in favour of first-home buyers.
So when you say you wanted your feelings known, or you made your feelings known, was your preference for an exemption?
Yep, our preference was for less impact on first-home buyers, and in the end, we don't want to ride over the top of the Reserve Bank. They have the independence, and so in the end it made their call.
So how the LVRs are disadvantaging first-home buyers as opposed to, for example, people who can afford to buy a second or third home, actually do legal equity hand those big deposits?
Well, I think it'll have some impact, and there's various numbers floating around on what that impact will be. But the counter argument to that, of course, is that if the property market gallops away, then we run the risk that those very first home buyers end up owning a property which severely depreciates when the housing bubble bursts, or they end up paying a lot more for their mortgage because interest rates go up a lot quicker. So I fully understand both the pain and frustration, but I'm telling you now, the fastest way through this problem is the track the government's taken, and that is make sure there's faster available supply of land, make sure the Resource Management Act is reformed, make sure that you have special housing areas like we have in Auckland for greater supply, make sure you're training enough people, and overall have a low interest rate environment for people.
But how are you going to get those 39,000 houses built in Auckland when the master builders say that at least 15% of those new home builds are for high LVR borrowers, which the Reserve Bank wants to halve the growth of those?
Well, it's an issue of supply, isn't it? I mean, if Auckland housing prices are going up 10-15% a year, then the point here is that if they go up less quickly as a result of the LVR restrictions, there'll still be plenty of demand there. So,
But the supply is going to be influenced by not enough new houses being built with those high LVR loans.
well, I don't think that's right.
Do you think the Reserve Bank has effectively communicated this change, given it's had such an impact on people's lives, that they have effectively communicated what is happening?
It's a complex issue for people to understand. For the vast bulk of people, they aren't actually caught by this, because if they're an existing homeowner, or if they have a home and they're buying another home, then they're not caught under these restrictions, or if they're using their KiwiSaver, they're not caught there. Or they could well be in a position where the bank still agrees to lend 90-95% of that against that loan. It's the overall management of the bank's balance sheet.
But can you see from, people can understand when you make a policy change, you're an elected government and you do that, or when the Reserve Bank does that, which is acting independently from you, is there some onus on them to try and communicate that in a way so people know what they're doing? Because a lot of people just think, for example, that it's the government.
Yes, that's right. So they think it's the government. It's not the government, it's the Reserve Bank. And the Reserve Bank are independent in their thought process. All I can do is say the things that they've said to me. I asked them directly the question, if you don't do this, what will be the impact on interest rates? And the argument was they would go up by about 50 basis points in the same period of time faster than they otherwise would be. And that means every business, every homeowner, everyone who's borrowed money personally from the bank would pay 0.5% more for their mortgage or their borrowings than they otherwise will do. And I still think in the end, if you look in markets where you've had high, rampant sort of property prices, over time that's led to a bubble. When that bubble has burst, it's had very far-reaching and damaging impacts on the economy. So yes, they're in slightly uncharted territory. I mean, there are a number of countries in the world that have done this, but not lots of countries. But I think we do need to give it a run and see what happens.
Has the government taken a look at any other
Countries have done.
any more issues on any more policy options that are more under direct control, like revisiting some of the tax issues around investment and housing as an investment as opposed to?
Well, we don't think that's likely to have a big impact. Again, the person that was on the Herald's lead story said was forgetting the fact that they would have been paying $20,000 more in interest. And the second point the person made, they're 23 years of age wanting to buy a property for $500,000. In fact, what they said is, I might buy it for an investment. Well, I hate to tell them, but the person they were standing next to, David Cunliffe's wanting to put a capital gains tax on that very property that they were talking about buying.
But doesn't the Reserve Bank's argument against first home exemptions, i.e. the 30-40% of first home buyers that are part of it, wouldn't that show that they are going to be predominantly affected by it and leaving the market open to other buyers who are also helping to pump up the market?
Well, by definition, no. What it means is the bulk of people, probably about 70%, aren't first home buyers, and they also borrow in general a bit more. So the question is, how will the bank structure what they're doing? And my view is they're likely to structure it in a way where the majority of high LVR loans they write will actually be for first home buyers, for the very reason I made earlier, because their long-term business model is supported by getting people in on the ground floor.
Just on the electricity market, Labor and the Greens are talking about MB figures from the past 5 years that show demand has dropped 1.6%, but prices are up 30%. They say that shows the system's not working.
Well, I haven't seen their numbers, and frankly, none of their numbers I ever see I can sort of backfill them to make any sense whatsoever. But what I can say is that under a Labor government, power prices went up 72%. Under us, they're up, but they're not up anywhere near that. And there's a number of reasons why power prices rise, and then that's everything from transmission costs going up to new generation coming on stream. So what we do know is if you follow the policy that Labor and the Greens have been talking about and you nationalise the power system, it will almost certainly lead to blackouts, to less investment, and actually no guarantee that prices will come down. In fact, might be prices probably go up.
Are prices too high at the moment, do you think?
Well, everyone always wants lower prices for everything, and I think that's the right approach we should all take. But whether there's no indication that they're out of whack. I mean, there's no indication that the businesses that operate in that space are earning anything other than a fairly normalised return on their assets.
They've also provided us with figures about the number of disconnections increasing each year. Does that concern you?
I just haven't seen those numbers.
You're hopeful of a low turnout for the referendum?
No, look, in the end, it'll be held and it'll be what it'll be. I mean, I'd be interested to see what the results look like. We'll be putting them next to the million people who voted for us and for this policy in the last election.
Will you be campaigning on the referendum?
No.
Not at all?
No, I mean, it'll be what it'll be. I mean, we've campaigned. We campaigned during the general election. It was dominant. The then Labor leader said this election is a referendum on disposition of the mixed ownership model, and we got the biggest result in national history. So I think we've had that referendum, but you know the law is quite clear. It demands that we hold it, and we'll be holding it.
What was the motivation
$9
for
million
that?
though would be essentially just to hold the referendum because you won't change your policy even if there's a strong vote.
I don't think the argument about the referendum is changing policy, because the Greens, you know, when the referendum was held on anti-smacking, were deeply opposed to a change in the policy. So unless they change their position on referendums.
Treasury today's some quite bullish forecasts saying 2% growth in the second half of this year. You yourself think the economy is in good shape. What should Kiwis expect next year from an economy that's growing at 3.5%?
Well, the last sort of kind of general chat I've had with the Reserve Bank and Treasury indicates some pretty strong numbers going into the election. They're talking about unemployment with a 5 in front of it. They're talking about growth of 3.5, maybe more. I think you'll see when you see the new overall numbers that they're going to be smaller deficit than people expect. Government's confident it'll meet its target of getting back into surplus. So if you sort of just backtrack and say we will have been in government for 6 years by the time we experience all of that, and you think of what the world's gone through and the shape we're in, then I think it argues pretty strongly, you know, we as a government have followed the right economic course and we're good economic stewards. And I think that'll be one of the big things we'll be wanting to talk about next year.
Does that mean next year, going into, if that's the case and it bears out, that tax cuts come back onto the agenda?
I genuinely can say we haven't looked at our policies that we'll be campaigning on for the 2014 election. Certainly, I'm struggling to envisage there'll be tax cuts next year. What policies we decide to campaign on, we'll have to have a look.
What about out years though? Could you go into an election campaign effectively saying, if things continue this way, we might look at tax cuts?
Well, we certainly haven't done that work, so it'd be a little way too premature for me to argue that case. But I know that certainly the Minister of Finance's view is he's very keen to see us repay debt. So let's see how things go.
But you're not ruling it out?
Well, we haven't done any of that work yet, and you know, we're a year or so out from an election, so it's a little bit early to write those policies now.
What specifically will you be raising with Tony Abbott?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't expect deliverables from the meeting. I don't think it's realistic for us to go over there and say, you know, as a result of the first meeting, that we'll come away with, you know, the changes or commitments, you know, particularly in an issue. But there are a huge number of things we need to talk about and familiarise ourselves with, and they'll range everything from, you know, economic issues that the two countries face. I mean, New Zealand continues to be, you know, a strong advocate, for instance, for imputation, you know, streaming of franking credits. I'm sure asylum seekers will come up. I'm sure there'll be issues around TPP, which we're jointly together in. So there'll be a range of different issues. New Zealanders who live in Australia, it's bound to be an issue that.
The whole,
So on
the
the,
whole,
sorry, on the asylum seekers, will you be wanting to go clear up or confirm whether the agreement that you reached with Julia Gillard still sticks with the new government?
Well, I'd be happy to talk about it. I mean, from New Zealand's perspective, we take 750 refugees under the UNHCR program every year. The agreement we reached with the previous government was that 600 would continue to come under the UNHCR program and 150 from Australia, or Australian territories. I'm happy with that. If the new Prime Minister decides he doesn't want to send them to New Zealand, then it won't effectively make it much impact for New Zealand. We'll just take 750 from the UNHCR program. I'd be amazed if he changes it, but if he wanted to, it's balls totally in their court.
the single economic market project seems to have
Yeah.
gone into a siding market or something. I wonder if that's coming back further up the agenda.
Yeah, I mean, they're going to be a very economically focused government, is my sense of just talking to him on the phone. And, you know, a lot of what he's talking about sounded very familiar to what we've been talking about. You know, I think in terms of trade, it's hard to see too many areas where we don't have total integration now in trade. And fundamentally, the issue of apples and defence have been resolved really. So there's essentially universal access. The real issue now, I think, is around the capital markets, and it is fundamentally that issue around invitation credits.
Will you continue to push the plight of Kiwis living in Australia and ask them to do more about it?
Yes, so the way we've always characterised that position is to say this issue gets raised with us. It's an issue that sometimes we see a degree of unfairness, and the Australian government's concurred with that view because after the floods, for instance, they made special provision for long-staying New Zealanders in Queensland. But in the end, it's really important that New Zealanders who might travel across the Tasman understand if they don't fit within their residency or citizenship rules that they'll be subject to these sort of worse conditions. And in the end, it's for the Australian government to, as a sovereign government, to make decisions about how they treat anyone that lives in their country.
So you're not going to push it any harder than you did with Julia Gillard?
We'll raise it and we'll talk about it, but we can't demand they make changes. Any more than that, they could make demands on how we might treat Australians in New Zealand.
Do you think that on imputation credits that the new government might take any different approach than the previous Australian governments, which have always said we lose more than you lose?
Look, in day one, that might be challenging. I mean, the numbers might be a bit different, but the last time I looked at it, I think it's 7 times more expensive for the Australian Treasury than it is for the New Zealand Treasury. But last year, I think was NZIER, I think from memory, did some work for the economic summit, and what they concluded was that, in their view, there was a much lower cost, potentially even no cost as a result of making this change, because the dividend flow that clearly is increased in the sense of recognising those franking credits is reinvested in the market and is captured through downstream tax activity. So we'll be making that case, and I think it's a matter of seeing where they could prioritise that. But from New Zealand's point of view, it matters. It matters a lot because the bulk of the investor base actually sits in Australia, and the impact of not having streaming invitation credits is it puts pressure on New Zealand head offices to relocate across the Tasman. That's the effect of the policy, and so we'd like to change that.
From memory, didn't Mr. Abbott or his incoming finance minister express negative views about that? Didn't they say we couldn't afford it?
Well, he was part of the previous government where Peter Costello was the treasurer, and we raised it back then when I was the opposition finance, the opposition finance spokesman, I think, leader of the opposition, with Peter Costello, and the Australian Treasury was negative. So.
Well, I thought the issue came up during the campaign, and the incoming government made some negative noises.
Don't know. But I mean, look, as I said, do I think we're going to get deliverables from the meeting on Wednesday? No. But what I do think is, A, it's very important that we are the first leaders there. Secondly, good chance to canvass the whole range of issues. Thirdly, it's about building up the chemistry and the rapport, which I think is starting from a very high position because I know Tony pretty well. And fourthly, putting on the table things that we think are important, and this is one of them.
Matthew Hooton has apologised for calling David Cunliffe a liar about what was in his CV about his work on terror. And but I think David Farris made some further claims today.
I haven't seen those ones, I'm sorry.
Well, Mr. Hooton's still saying that Mr. Mr. Cunliffe has some questions to answer about his CV. Do you have a view on that? So,
To be honest, I really tangentially followed it when I was overseas, but I didn't delve into every bit of it. I mean, if there are questions to answer, then I'll take it you guys are going to ask them the question. I mean, you know, the only thing I saw him saying was that we were behind that. That's not true. National Party's not behind it. The truth is that any leader of a major political party faces much higher levels of scrutiny than you do if you're not the leader. I've been subjected to that for the last 7 years now. I think everything from my physical health through to my bank accounts have been well and truly scrutinised by the press gallery, and I'm sure the same will happen for Mr. Cunliffe, but hey, it comes with the job.
Are you expecting a deliverable from APEC on TPP?
Well, there won't be a deal because a deal ultimately would have to be ratified by Cabinet, and Cabinet hasn't even discussed the matter today. But I think we are making good progress. It's quite clear there are 2 or 3 quite big areas where there's more work that needs to be done. My understanding is the negotiators are doing a pretty good job at starting to cut through some of that stuff. So I think it will be more about momentum and about the next steps of when we think we can get to, you know, a final decision that we can actually contemplate and then ultimately decide to, you know, either accept or reject.
What are those 2 or 3 areas where there's an issue?
Well, it's the obvious, you know, agriculture and intellectual property and those sort of areas.
Prime Minister, now that you're back, can I ask you how you feel about being called a galloping colonial clot?
Much maligned, actually, on the basis that A, it was, I think, from memory, a television in New Zealand or TV3 camera that was in there, and B, a herald photographer, so I didn't release any pictures from my time there. And secondly, I'm totally comfortable that any of the comments I made were in line with the expectations of what the Palace would expect me to say. So I'm very comfortable I followed all of the right protocols.
Given that the Daily Mail is very open about what it thinks of you, what do you think of it?
I wouldn't wrap my fish and chips in it.
Do you think they're jealous of you?
Don't know. Didn't like my pink tie either, so there you go. I've lucked out everywhere.
Do you think that your living room looks like a bed and breakfast?
I don't think I'll even go there, actually.
Do you start the announced retirement of Chris Tremaine? Was that a surprise?
Yeah, a little bit of surprise, I've got to say, but you know, I'm always shocked by the odd sort of retirement that comes along. The last election we had a few. Yeah, I mean, Chris has done a tremendous job. He's had 9 great years. He won the seat of Napier that we hadn't won for 50 years, so it was an incredible result when he did it. But I can understand completely. He's a young man. He's got a relatively young family. He's got some strong commercial interests he wants to follow, and he feels he's made a good contribution. But it's time for him to go and do something else. So we'll miss him, but I understand.
Do you think it will make it more difficult to win that seat at the election?
It's always it's quite a tough seat for us. I mean, A, because we hadn't held it for a long period of time. Although the party vote was plus 6,000 for us in the last election, and I think Chris's majority was plus 3,000. So it's always tougher when you're not coming off being the incumbent MP because of name recognition. And he went into that seat when he won it. He won it against Russell Fairbrother, who I think was generally seen as not a high-performing MP as it turned out. And secondly, Chris had really big name recognition. So yes, it's always going to put challenges on us there, but the job of the National Party in the local area down is to come up with a good candidate.
Anybody else indicate that they're going to step aside the next election?
Yeah, there's 1 or 2 in terms of MPs that I'm aware that are likely to retire 2014. You always get a few. We've got a caucus of 59, so there'll be a few.
When do you like to make an announcement, or when are they likely to make an announcement? Are you going through a period where this is being tidied up?
We're not forcing the pace on it, and I was a bit surprised with Chris, but he told me after Cabinet a couple of weeks ago, and I've been away, and he's got an opportunity to talk to his office and a few other bits and pieces. So because he's a minister, it makes it a bit more complicated.
Are these 1 or 2 high profile, or backbenchers?
No, I think you'd find them reasonably critical.
Are you planning a reshuffle before Christmas?
Don't think so, no.
Have you had a health checkup since your term in the States?
No. Grateful I didn't throw up on the press gallery, who I'm sure would have thought less of me if they'd seen my lunch, but no.
Do you support lowering the blood alcohol limit for drivers?
government's going through the process that we sparked off a while ago, which is looking at the evidence of accidents involved in or potential fatalities of people involved with blood alcohol reading of between 0.05 and 0.08. When we have that evidence back and we have a chance to assess it, then we'll make the call on whether we think blood alcohol levels should be lowered. Not ruling it out, but we did want to see what impact it would actually genuinely have.
Will you support the private members bill going through the select committee in that case?
My preference would be to get the evidence back before we had to do that, because in the end, if the evidence supports a lowering of the blood alcohol level, then the government actually really doesn't need the members bill. It'll just effectively make that government policy and then just progress it. If we don't, then there'd be no point in us voting for it. But I can't exactly tell you how far away we are from completing it. It's getting closer, I know that, because I think Jerry's been either, I don't know if he's got the information, he certainly doesn't have the information, but I know it's getting closer. I asked him a while ago.
Is the government any closer to a deal on Solid Energy's debt restructure?
Yes, it's getting closer, and expect an announcement, I think, this week.
And look, Labour got a bit of a bump in the Herald Digipol last week. We've spoken to some brokers who say that that is fueling fears or expectations that there might be a change of government, that there might be NZ power within a few years, and that is affecting demand for marine shares.
Doesn't stack up with anything we've seen. I mean, the 45% that we sold on broker firm was above the expectations that they had.
Just on APEC again, how much momentum do you think we'll get for TPP from having Barraga there this year?
My read of it is that the American administration wants to do the deal. So they've been committed behind it. And I think progress we're making is really good. I was always a bit of the view that by the time we got to APEC in Bali, that we'd be a long way down the track, but not at the finishing line, and that's the way I describe it. I think I'll be surprised if that meeting doesn't have a good positive feel to it, and put us in a position to actually round out a deal, but we're not, it's just not the end.
And did the US make a dairy offer to us?
The negotiators have been going back and forth, and my understanding has been fairly high level in terms of the discussions that we've had. They've sort of closed off lots of chapters where there's agreement and quarantined off a few that they haven't. So I haven't seen them come at us and say, here's a particular proposal and us reject it, if that's your question. I think it's much more high level now at the moment.
Just on the TPP talks, what's the government's position on releasing the negotiating text or the negotiating draft, as a number of people have called for?
Sure. We're not going to do that. It's a bit of an odd way to carry out a negotiation, because by definition, if you were doing that every time there's a twist and turn in the story, you'd have to go back and re-release that. And I don't think that would actually add much to it. It's never been the way it's happened in the past, so we're better to adopt a consistent approach. But look, in the end, assuming a deal can be agreed, then the Cabinet would have to agree to it, obviously, and ultimately we'd have to build a parliamentary majority to support it, and it would have to be ratified by Parliament. So in the fullness of time, there'll be complete disclosure about what's going on. But it's like any sort of complex and delicate negotiation. I don't think they're generally best held through the gaze of the media. I think it's better to do that in a logical sort of environment, and then later on go out and release it.
Do you think it can be passed through this Parliament?
Possibly. Yeah, possibly. Okay.